Welcome in to the Storycraft Cafe. I am your host, Hank Garner. Today, as always, super excited to welcome Christopher Paolini to the show. We've done, I don't know, 5 or 6 of these by now, it seems like, and it's always fun to pick the brain of a master. And like Christopher is, if you have been living under a rock for the last 2 decades, Christopher Paolini is the author of the Inheritance Cycle, which now includes 5 books and a novella or a shorter novel, and also 2 entries in the Fractal Verse so far. So not only has Christopher planted his flag in the fantasy genre, but now also science fiction. I asked Christopher if he would come on today to discuss kind of the building blocks of genre fiction. And today I thought, just kind of as a premise to start discussion, would be fun to talk about tropes. Welcome to the show, Christopher. And you're muted. Looks like you're still muted. There you are.
I was just saying thanks for having me back on. I guess you're not tired of the sound of my voice. That's why
Absolutely.
That's why I was keeping myself muted. It's the funny thing is that the very first panel I ever did was San Diego Comic-Con when I was 19, and it was on tropes in fantasy.
Oh, that's
and
so
on
funny.
that panel was Terry Brooks, Peter David, and China Mieville, and 19-year-old me. So I was wildly, drastically, horrendously unqualified to have that discussion at that point, and they were all very kind to me, which was nice. But it's kind of fun to be talking about this a couple of decades later, especially since I'm perhaps known for my use of tropes in certain stories, and I'll happily cop to that. So I think the first thing I'd say on that topic is just that tropes are tropes for a reason. They're story elements, world building elements that people respond to and thus work. So they are one of many very useful tools that a storyteller has in their arsenal.
Right. And for whatever reason, tropes, the word trope gets used as a 4-letter word in a lot of highbrow circles, but tropes are common narrative devices, plot elements, character types, and other recurring features that appear frequently across many works of fiction. They're conventions or archetypes that readers recognize from their exposure to various stories. While some people criticize tropes as cliches, they're actually neutral tools that can be used effectively or poorly depending on the writer's skill. And some common trope types that you'll encounter in fiction: the chosen one trope, love triangle, rags to riches, fish out of water, the evil twin or doppelganger, the mentor protege relationship, last minute rescue, secret identity. And I think you could take a number of these tropes and think about your favorite stories and identify those. And for that reason, tropes are not a bad word. They're not something to be avoided. As a matter of fact, tropes give your reader a sense of familiarity and to know that they're safe in your storytelling universe. You alluded to that sometimes people have things to say about your use of tropes. But what do you mean by that?
Well, before I address that, I'll say, in the arts, and as this applies to every type of art, execution is everything. When someone says, is it a good idea to write a story with this as the main character, or from this point of view, or using this technique? The answer is always, it could be, depending on your skill and execution. You could take a very well-worn story and well-worn character ideas, aka tropes, cliches, if you will, give them to 100 different creators, and you will get 100 different interpretations of that material. And even if they slavishly followed a tradition, an outline that was given to them, the very fact that one person versus another is the one to execute that material is going to create a difference in execution. No one is you. No one, you are the only you in the universe.
Right.
So you might as well embrace that. And just by the fact that you are saying something or interpreting material will make it unique. As far as my own usage of tropes, it was very conscious. When I had started writing or tried to write a number of stories before Eragon, and I never got past the first 5 or 6 pages. And to be clear, these were book ideas.
Yeah.
And the main reason is that I didn't actually have the plot. I didn't have the story. I would have the inciting incident. So that would be something like, boy finds dragon egg in forest, but not much past that aside from maybe a general idea. So when I set out to write Eragon, I was trying to find out if I could actually write something that was 300, 400, 500 pages in length. That was my goal. And I wasn't intending to sell the book. I'd never meant to publish it. Because I'd read so many stories of authors who write, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 books before getting published. And I was totally prepared for that.
Right. Well, you were 15 at the time.
Exactly.
You had an entire lifetime ahead of you.
Yeah, I had no illusions. I mean, I was reading all these articles by authors saying I had to write 4 books and stick them in a drawer before I got published. So I was like, okay, that's what I'm going to do.
Right.
And to pursue this goal, I figured I would take the heroic monomyth as espoused by Joseph Campbell. And you might say, well, why is a 15-year-old talking about Joseph Campbell's, work?
Right.
Well, I had a great uncle. He was both a great uncle and a great uncle, if you catch my meaning. My mother's uncle, and he gave me on cassette tape, obsolete technology now, but the full collection of the whole interview or series of interviews between PBS's host Bill Moyers and Joseph Campbell. And I listened to those things start to finish many, many times. And I had also read a lot of folklore and mythology growing up, which our library had a nice collection of. And between all of that and my love of fantasy and science fiction, I said, okay, I'm going to do my interpretation of the classic hero story using all the tropes. So we're going to have the wise old mentor. We're going to have the evil king. We're going to have dragons and elves and dwarves and the magic sword. And I'll put my own spin on it to a certain degree. But the main reason I'm doing this is that I know this works as a story. It's worked for thousands of years.
Sure.
I could take Eragon 5,000 years ago and tell people the story of Eragon. It would pretty much make sense to people. And that's going to serve as a safety net for me, the inexperienced writer, so that I can concentrate on the things that I know I am the most deficient at, which are technique, character, pacing, basically all of the technical skills that come with writing. And of course, if you were to look at the inheritance cycle and all the way up to the most recent addition to that world, Murtag, I think you would see an evolution from writing that is much more, let's say, surface-oriented, action-oriented, to writing that's much more character and language-oriented. And that's just, again, been my journey of trying to master those elements. So long answer to a short question, but it was a very conscious deployment of tropes. It didn't happen by accident. I wasn't just like, oh, I have no thoughts of other types of stories I can tell. It was like, no, I'm going to use things I know work so that I can get better as a writer. And it's the same way that, an artist would go into a museum, sit in front of all the great masters and start, copying paintings or using elements from different paintings. So you learn and you grow and you figure out, how did they do it so that I can do it?
It's really interesting because tropes are things that readers expect from you. If you say you are publishing a fantasy novel, there are certain things you expect to find in that. Are we going to find a wizard? Is there going to be a dragon? Are there going to be elves? And then it's up to the writer to take these tools that are in his or her toolkit and then fashion something completely new, but with the same tools or the same building blocks that we've used for 5,000 years, like you alluded to a minute ago. It's what you do with those that then bring your story, make it stand out from the group. So kind of going with that, how do you then take these well-worn, well-established tools or building blocks and fashion something completely new.
So, all right, are we back?
Yeah, yeah,
We're
I'm
back.
not sure if that was me or you, but
Not sure.
yeah, looks like we've got a
Either.
little.
All right, is it going to hold this
Yep,
time?
I fingers crossed. Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. Let me text my family and make sure that our cloud backup is not.
Sure.
Okay, there we go. So it's funny that you mentioned what you did because when the Eragon film that wasn't being made,
Was never made.
was never made. I actually provided feedback of this sort to the people who weren't making the film, because if you were to attempt to watch the film that doesn't exist, and I know this is getting tiresome, but I'm going to keep it up because I enjoy it. Uh, you would notice that you wouldn't notice any dwarves or elves in the film, even though, of course, dwarves and elves play a major role in the inheritance cycle.
Right.
And yet there are actors credited as dwarves and at least one elf, the elf Arya, in the movie. And the reason for that is basically they got scared by Lord of the Rings, and I think, was it the second film or Return of the King? One of those had just come out when they started work on Aragon, and so they got scared of dwarves and elves. And so I wrote this long message to them and said, "Look, when someone reads fantasy, they want, assuming they're choosing to read high fantasy that has dwarves and elves and
Sure.
dragons, they want to actually read about those things. And, all of the different authors who play in this genre, we treat elves and dwarves and dragons and other creatures like, there are shared ideas of what those creatures are. And you can certainly deviate and create your own version of that. And people do that.
Mhm.
I think of like Tad Williams with his Scythe, which are his version of elves.
Right.
And there are many others. But if you have creatures that are called elves, there's certain things that we kind of think of as an elf. And
Right.
I was very much playing in that sort of expected space with my elves and my dwarves. So I said, yeah, you're going to lose your audience. You're going to anger them or disappoint them by not living up to those tropes, if you will. And there are unique elements to my elves and dwarves. But if you don't even acknowledge them as elves and dwarves, you can't explore those unique elements because it's tied to the nature of that species.
You when you finished the original Inheritance cycle, book 4, and that was a decade ago, or maybe
Yeah,
a little.
2011 actually,
Yeah,
so more than.
2011. Yeah, more than a decade ago. You started working on your science fiction world and series, and that was a decade ago, when
Mm,
you first started talking about it online, and you and I had talked several years ago, and you talked about um, the building blocks that were going into transitioning from a fantasy author to building the science fiction world and all of the
mhm.
things that were going into it. Um, First off, when you shifted gears and started writing the fractal verse, did you have to think differently about story after being so immersed in fantasy and all of the things that made up, um, first the fantasy genre and then the world that you had created, and then you're stepping out of that and doing something completely different. Um, did you have to retrain your brain as a writer to think differently?
No.
Okay.
Um, in fact, I actually got myself into trouble by not thinking about the story in the way that I had with the Inheritance Cycle. I strongly feel that storytelling uses the same tools no matter what genre or type of story you're trying to execute. You might be more or less experimental. You might be more or less sophisticated depending on the type of story and the genre and your own personal talents, of course. But the tools remain the same and they work no matter what the genre is. If you're writing literary fiction and it's very character based, the way that you build and pace a scene, it still uses the basic steps that you would use anywhere else. If you're doing horror, if you're doing romance, I mean, the tools are all there. They get tailored a little bit per the specific needs of the story, but they're still the same. And when I started my science fiction, I think we've talked about this before. I got a little cocky, and because first book I ever wrote got published, it did extraordinarily well, and each book after that did extraordinarily well, and then I did that for about 10 years. So I went into it thinking, hey, I know what I'm doing. I don't need to, put too much work into plotting this out. I can do it as I go. And that did not work. And that's why To Sleep in a Sea of Stars ended up taking probably 4 years longer to write than it really should have. So what was different was the sort of the genre requirements of science fiction versus fantasy. So and again, it just depends how you tend to approach the genre. You can write science fiction like it's fantasy. Star Wars is a great
Right.
example. I wanted to be a little more grounded with my travel, my technology, so I put a lot of research into that. I really stuck very rigorously with the actual like travel times of my spaceships and what my technology was capable of, and that was different. And language-wise, getting to use a modern vocabulary, a futuristic modern vocabulary, was also uh, new and exciting and fun, since I'd been working with more of a fantasy vocabulary for so long.
Sure.
So I think those were the biggest differences, but the basic storytelling uh, tools were the same. And once I realized how the mistake I had made, and sort of took a step back and said, okay, do the work that you should have done in the first place. That's when I was finally able to get the story working the way I wanted to.
Yeah. Well, then you came back to the world of Allegasia and with Murtagh
Hmm.
last year. When you decided to step back into that world, that you had another story to tell, or you wanted to continue the story
Right.
that you were telling, was it like putting on a comfortable old coat, a
Yeah.
pair of shoes that were nicely broken in? Like, how long did it take you to get back in that mindset?
About 5 pages.
Nice.
When I was plotting it out, it was very quickly. I was back in the world very quickly, but in the actual writing, I'd say about 5 pages to just fully wake up those muscles. It wasn't bad at all. I, I worked on the series for such a long time and during such a formative part of my life that it really did wire my brain in certain ways. So you could wake me up at 3 a.m, put a gun to my head, and say, write something with Eragon and Saphira. I don't even have to think about it. It's always, that voice is always there. Now, compared with To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, for example. Now I started To Sleep in a Sea of Stars officially in, let's see, I was touring through 2012. I was researching and world building all through 2013. So I really started To Sleep in a Sea of Stars 2014, and it wasn't published until 2020. So that's about, let's say, 7 years or so of work. And in that time, I also wrote the first draft of Fractal Noise. So there was a lot going on. But
Yeah.
now it's a longer book than Murtagh. But by comparison, I did my homework before I started Murtagh. I really thought about the characters. I really thought about the story. And I wrote the first draft in 3.5 months. So
That's
if I have my roadmap, I'm a pretty fast writer.
yeah. We have a comment. Dutch Daddy Gamer said, "I think I remember that roughly 60 to 70% of To Sleep in a Sea of Stars had to be rewritten."
Yes.
What was the yeah, how did you come to that determination that okay, I need to deconstruct this, and like
Mm.
what was that process like to come to that realization, and then how do you develop a plan of how to address it?
Oh, that's a big question, and it's a painful question.
It's like 8 questions, but, you know.
Yeah, first of all, I always have a sense of whether something is working or not when I'm writing. The problem is that I'm extraordinarily stubborn, and you kind of have to be to write large books. And so sometimes in the past, when I've gotten the feeling like, well, something's a little off, I'm not really feeling this, I've learned to just kind of grit my teeth and keep moving, because you can't fix something that doesn't exist. Now, I'm not sure I would do that to the level I did in the past. I had various things going on in my life at the time I was writing To Sleep in a Sea of Stars. And so the writing itself was my energy, my life. It was difficult. And so I ignored that feeling that things weren't quite clicking and just pushed through. Now, if you haven't read the book, you have to understand that the book is about 300,000 words long. The first draft was like 320,000 words long. For comparison, Eragon is 156,000 words long. So it's a big book. It's not quite as long as
Yeah.
something like, well, actually, it might be around the size of the first game, Game of Thrones.
Right.
But some of those
Or it's
books
a
are like
Brandon Sanderson short story.
well, I mean, like Way of Kings and some of the books in that
Yeah.
series are 400,000 words
Right.
long, in that range. So
Yeah.
that should give you a size, a feeling for the size. But it's 300,000 some words is a massive, massive, massive book.
Sure.
And so the problem is so first of all, when I had my family read it, they gave me the feedback that it just wasn't clicking ultimately with the main character. It's like the world building's great, side characters are interesting, the story of the main character is not working, and that is the story of the book. So it's like the book's not working. And the sunk cost fallacy is you don't want to give up on something you've put a lot of time into. And that includes just words on the page. So my first instinct was to try to fix it without having to trash most of the book. And that's what I did so I finished the first draft beginning of 2016. And I've spent most of 2016 and deep into 2017. So that's about a year and a half or so. Rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic is how I've put it. So it was I was fixing a lot of surface things, and the fixes were decent, and the writing was improving, but the structural problems were not ultimately getting addressed. And finally, my editor at Random House, even though the book wasn't published there, she agreed to look at an early version with the hopes that it might be published at Random House. But she looked at it and she said, "Look, it's still not working." So I had to decide at that point, do I just abandon it and work on something new, which in a lot of ways would have been easier, or do I really try to find a way to fix this? And so at this point, I'd been working on it since 2014 to 2017. So now that's what, 3 years,
Right.
3 solid years, 3 very difficult years. So I just stepped away from the manuscript and I said, okay, this is where I went back to first principles. I said, what did I do with the inheritance cycle that I'm not doing here, that I haven't done? I wrote 200 pages of notes by hand in a week and a half. And I
Wow.
have all those notebooks here. It's just, and what I did was I ripped apart every character. I ripped apart every event. And not like what, and then they go here. No, it's like structurally, why do we go here? What is this doing for the character? Why is this happening? Where is it going? What is it? What's the payoff? I mean, like all those basic questions.
Yeah.
And I reconstructed the story. So if anyone who's listening has read To Sleep or reads To Sleep, the book is divided into large sections.
Right.
Everything past like the first 20 pages of section 2 was essentially written from scratch. There were no nightmares. There was no trip to Orsted Station or Nidus or Cordova at the end. All of that is new. What did remain is the actual ending of the book, the very last scene, funnily enough, because that's why I wrote the story, was that scene ultimately.
Right.
So everything else is there to justify that last scene. So that then was a massive, like, again, the writing went fast once I had a decent plan, but a 300,000 word book is not quick to write, even if you're a quick writer. So that then was the bulk of the end of 2017 and deep toward the end of 2018 was when I would consider I finally had the first draft of the version everyone's read. And then, end of 2018. And then we were marketing, we had to find a publisher then beginning of 2019. And then most of 2019, I was editing, getting that ready. And then it actually published in 2020.
Wow.
Yeah. It was a heck of a journey. It might even have taken, it took even a little longer with some of the editing. So yeah. because
Wow.
there were a lot of sort of seams that needed to be ironed out between the different versions and who the characters had been and who they became. And so I'm going to toot my own horn here for a second. Forgive me. It's a horrible thing to do, but it meant a lot to me after that process that my agent, who's a very good agent, told me that he thought I was one of the best, if not the best, reviser in the industry after that experience, which I really appreciated.
Absolutely. That's yeah, you did the work, and it shows on the page.
Thank you. Well, I
Yeah.
think the reason revising is so difficult is that whenever you create something, that first version it exists like a pattern in your brain, and you have
Right.
to literally rewire that pattern. It's almost like changing a religious belief or a political belief. Like it can almost physically hurt.
Mm.
Um, but you kind of have to do it if you want the work to be good.
Right, right. MV writing, we're gonna get to your comment in just a minute because I also have something I want to ask Christopher about that as well. But Gavin Ride says, "What was the draw for a new sci-fi
Mm.
world instead of a new fantasy world? New tropes to play with, or something else?" And I would just tag Gavin's question with, "Was there ever a point in the revision of To Sleep in a Sea of Stars where you just doubted that you were a science fiction writer?" I don't think anyone would have blamed you for just being a fantasy author, as if just being the author of the Inheritance Cycle is anything to look down on. But you know, maybe I'm just not cut out to write science fiction. Maybe I'm just a science fiction fan. And did
That's
those thoughts ever cross your mind?
That's an interesting question. Funnily enough, no. The question that was in my mind wasn't, can I write fantasy science fiction?
Yeah.
It was, can I even write a book
Mm,
that works? Because
right.
no,
Am
writing
I
science
just a one
fiction,
trick pony?
yeah, writing science fiction was not the challenge. Writing a book that worked was the challenge. I mean,
Wow.
and I'm not trying to put science fiction down. To me, though, again, the tools you use to develop a fantasy world are very much the tools you use to develop a science fiction setting. You're looking at technology, which can also be equated to both technology and magic in a fantasy world. You're looking at creating imaginary societies and places and names and peoples. I mean, it's all the same skill set in a lot of ways. I read as much sci-fi as fantasy growing up, and I still do. I love the genre. I love dreaming about the future and the future that I hope humans will have out among the stars. If there were an option to go out and colonize with my family, I'd take that. I'd punch that ticket. And to me, it's to get existential here for a second. It's a very simple calculation. We know that in a relatively short time, the sun's going to expand and boil off all the oceans, and then eventually expand even
Right.
further and swallow the Earth. There
Yeah.
is a deadline for not just humanity, but every species on this planet. And there probably isn't enough. If we go extinct, there probably isn't enough time for another intelligent, technological, intelligent species that can use technology to evolve and get off the planet. I mean, it's only happened once in the entire history of this planet and perhaps the universe, as far as we know. It's unlikely it's the only one. We're the only ones, but again, we're the only ones we have the example of. And if we truly care about the living creatures on this planet, all of them, we are the only hope for life on this planet to survive in the long term. If we don't get off this planet and take living things with us, everything on this planet is going to get killed by the sun in the long run. Simple as that. So, unless we're willing to lay down and accept that fate, and I don't think humans are, we never have been the sort to lay down and just go gently into that darkness.
Right.
Then I think we have to look to the future. We have to look to the stars. And that's one of my main motivations for writing science fiction, actually. And I love thinking about it.
Well, and there's kind of a divide in the camp of is science fiction hopeful, or is it you know nihilistic?
Mm,
Because I think we've seen great examples of both. I
yeah.
personally prefer my science fiction to be on the hopeful side, but that's just a
Same.
personal. I like to think
No,
I'm a little more of a sunny person than that. But
but I try to be realistic. I mean, I don't expect humans to turn into angels over the course of 100 years or 300 years.
right,
It's not going to happen. I mean, anatomically, modern humans popped up what, like 200 some thousand years ago. Humans from 10,000 years ago really are no different than humans now. So I wouldn't expect any different in.
what is? I don't know where that came from. Excuse
Oh,
me.
you caught the no comment.
Ah.
Oh.
Anyway, sorry about that.
No, it's fine.
Yeah.
I wrote a very cheeky letter to a fan who wrote some very deep questions, and so I did what do you call it? A cross stick with the paragraphs going down that says so that it says no comment.
I love it. I love it.
Anyway,
Anyway,
yeah. So that's a lot of my motivation for writing science fiction. Plus, it's just fun to play in a different genre.
yeah, absolutely. Let's look at another comment that we got from MV Writing. I know it's not the intent for this, and we're open to whatever topics come up. But curious, to what level do you outline? Do you do wave tops, or already know in detail the scenes and orders prior to writing? And then second part, and did you find that you needed further outline / detail when you left a familiar trope genre and branched into sci-fi? I would only tag that onto that question that in the writing and rewriting of To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, you had to I'm assuming that you had to break apart your outline and the plan that you had laid out, you discovered in the writing was not working. So how do you replan and reshuffle that outline so that you then maintain your roadmap that you're using, but knowing that that original roadmap wasn't doing what you intended for it to do?
Yeah. I think anyone who watches my interviews will know that I'm a huge fan of outlining. At least for me, I can only keep so many things in my head when I'm writing, and if I'm trying to build a story while writing it, my few brain cells just sort of give up the ghost, and it just does not work for me. Also, I hate wasting my time, as most people do, and ending up in sort of the middle of a story and feeling like you're grinding your wheels and feeling directionless because you're trying to find your way through. I hate that. I really hate that. I love going into a scene and knowing what the scene is trying to accomplish, at least on one level. Scenes usually do more than one thing. And even if you think it's doing X, your readers may come back and say, well, yes, you did X, but you also did Y. And that is and that's interesting too. So if you know what a scene is supposed to accomplish for the character and for the story, then you can do so much more to serve that scene. Now, sometimes, and this is where the pantsers come in, the seat of your pants writers.
Sure.
Sometimes you're not entirely sure. You write a version of the scene, and then when you get to read it, you can say, "Oh, now I know what I'm trying to do," or "Now I know what it could do, and I can guide it in that direction." And that is a valid way of writing. But when you're working on a very large property, that can be just prohibitively time consuming, as we've seen with some very famous authors. I'm not going to name some names here, who prefer to garden perhaps more than plotting. So yeah, no, I'm a huge fan of outlining, and I am becoming more and more of an outliner the more I go along, to the point where before I start a book, I want to know exactly what my main character is going to go through, whether it is the sort of story where the character changes, or if they're a static character like James Bond. So it's the world that changes around the static character versus like the internal journey of a character who's going through a maturation story. But regardless, I want to know what I'm doing there, and then how each scene is going to serve the character's journey or the conveyance of information about the world, if especially if the world itself is going to change. And then I will usually do a detailed outline, minimum. I mean, usually they run about 10 to 14 pages. I'll do a paragraph for each essentially each scene. And I will say, not just, and here's the trick, when you do an outline, don't just write down what happens. Like, Eragon finds a dragon egg in the forest. Okay, great. That's what happens. What does it mean, though?
Right.
Because that's ultimately what matters throughout. So, okay, so his, such and such character dies. Okay, what does that mean for who's left, right? And that will really make it come alive because that tells you what everything is doing for the characters emotionally. This is actually also how I approach screenwriting and is serving me very well at the moment because I'm working on a couple of scripts that are pretty intense. So that's my answer to that. Outlining is a wonderful, wonderful tool. And some people now the only downside is that some people feel as if they outline too much and they lose their inspiration for writing. It's like they've already written the story. There's very little
Yeah.
discovery then. And I have sympathy for that because I've had that feeling once or twice myself. But at least when it comes to novels versus scripts, I feel like there's so much discovery that still happens in the line to line writing and the actual interactions of the characters. Like, yes, I'll say, um, Murtagh is going to interact with Thorn in this scene, and the scene is going to accomplish X. But how I actually get to X is going to be something I will discover in the moment based on my understanding of the characters and my own feelings for how scenes should be paced. And then, of course, that can be tweaked in revisions, but that's where a lot of the discovery happens.
Yeah. I like to think of it like having a roadmap. If I'm going from San Diego to New York, for instance, I know I can either take the southern route across the United States and then turn and go up the East Coast, or I can go directly across the center of the country, and I can know that I'm going to go from San Diego to Colorado to St. Louis, and that way. And but what happens between Colorado and St. Louis might be, it's kind of open for. I know I'm going to wind up there, but all kind of magic can happen in between those 2 points.
And the type of journey, like if you need to get to San Diego as quickly as possible,
right,
you're going to have a different journey than if you decide I'm going to visit every national park I can along the way, right? And so knowing what your destination needs to be allows you to tailor every scene and event to try to hopefully serve that final destination. And that's actually my favorite thing in storytelling, when you get to the end of a film or a book and all of the events that have led to that point sort of play into what the characters ultimately decide to do and how they change at the very end. And that's a hard thing to do. And I'm not entirely sure I've succeeded at it myself at times. But that is what I enjoy.
Yeah. You mentioned screenwriting a minute ago, and you brought it up first. So I get to say, what's the any new news on the Disney Plus series?
There should be a major announcement coming soon, but it's out of my control as to when exactly that announcement happens because corporations. So I have been working quite a lot on scripts this past month and a half or so, a lot actually. So that's if anyone wants to draw some inferences from that, they can. But yeah, I think God, what did I do? Almost 30 pages in the last 3 days. So
oh, that's incredible. That's incredible. We got a really fun question here. I'm going to pop up from Ains Taylor. How do you decide which tropes storylines you bring across the Paolini verse? I love that. To connect the world of Eragon and the fractal verse. I'm really loving the overarching light versus dark that you're playing with.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Are there connections between Allegasia and the fractal verse?
No comment.
No
I mean,
comment again.
I think the larger answer to that is just that I have my own specific obsessions and interests, and that is naturally going to lead to thematic similarities in whatever I work on. But there are very specific choices I'm making with the fractal verse in the world of Eragon that are intentional, and what you're seeing is not accidental.
Gotcha. For Q&A, who are the Lost Kings?
Well, they're the ones that haven't been mentioned that people don't talk about. Maybe I'll do some more on them in the future.
That would be fun. That would be fun. Thanks for your comprehensive answer. I've decided to do entire scene level outlining for the novel
Mm,
attempt that helps reinforce the decision. I thought I was a pantser until two failed attempts. I love that. I thought I was a pantser
yeah,
until I learned otherwise. Were you
good luck
a
with that.
plotter from the very beginning? Like, what was your process for the original Eragon?
I
Did you
mean,
know that you needed to be a plotter, or, you know, how
well,
were you thinking about that at the time?
before Aragon, I was not a plotter. I would just get a story idea and think that's really cool, and I could kind of feel like, oh man, this could play out in an epic way, and I'd have kind of that general sense, and I just want to write it because you get get a new idea, it fills you with energy, you're excited about it, you want to just go in and write, and so that's what I would do as a young person, and I always fizzled out, and uh, I ended up reading a bunch of books on how to write because my parents saw I was interested in writing, and these books magically appeared in the house. In fact, I have all of the books right here. Some of the ones that were helpful for me were the Writer's Handbook, which was published annually by the Writer's Digest magazine, and it was a collection of essays by different
Yeah.
professional writers on all sorts of different topics, on all different aspects of publishing, both the creative side and the business side. So that was the Writer's Handbook. Don't confuse that with the Writer's Market. I think that was another one. No, so the Writer's Handbook. They no longer publish it, but you can get out of print copies out on the net. And then the big one for me was a screenwriting book called Story by Robert McKee, which is a classic screenwriting sort of very technical book that examines all the mechanics of storytelling. And until I read it, I had never really consciously thought about the fact that plots were something you could consciously control. I thought, well, you get an idea and you write it and it develops and hopefully you end up with something good. Because of reading that book, I decided that I was going to create a story, create a world, a fantasy world, and plot out the whole story and then not write it. So I was, yeah, late 14, early 15 when I did this. I still have this outline in this world I created. It starred a princess named Arya. And then I was very methodical. So I did all of that. And that was a month or two of work. And then I shelved it and I said, okay, now I'm going to again create a new world, again plot out a story, but this time it'll be a trilogy instead of one book because all great fantasy series are trilogies, and I will write the first book as a practice novel, and that was Eragon. So by the time I actually started Eragon, I put a lot of work into the structure and the characters, and that really served me well.
Wow. Um, you've mentioned screenwriting a couple of times, and we know that you've been working on the Aragon TV show with Disney
Hmm.
Plus, and some other projects
Hmm.
apparently that maybe you'll drop something on us. Who knows? Or no comment. Um, as you are prone to do. Um, but what have you learned from your foray into screenwriting? Have you learned things from screenwriting that then affect your novel writing brain?
Mm.
Or are there tools from novel writing that you've brought into screenwriting? I know they're very different forms
Hmm.
ultimately, but at the core, you're still telling a story. So how do
Yeah,
they differ? But how are they the same?
that's a great question. I think television is probably more novelistic than film, just because there's more space and time to
Right.
tell the stories over multiple episodes. Uh, I think one of the things is that film and television perhaps feels a bit more free to hop around visually, which is something that could be confusing to a reader. It's something writers used to do a little bit more of when the omniscient point of view was more popular.
Yeah.
For those who don't know, I have a deluxe edition of Murtag publishing this year on October 15th. And I wrote some additional scenes for it, which is the first time I've really done that for one of these deluxe editions. We've done deluxe editions for all of the Inheritance cycle, so of course we're doing one for Murtag.
It looks
And this is a
gorgeous, by the way.
sorry.
It looks gorgeous, by the way.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you. And I did there's all sorts of cool art in it. It's gorgeous.
nice.
Random House did a great job. But the stuff I wrote actually uses some of the techniques that I've been using in the scripts I've been working with. So I'll be curious how people respond to that. It's a little bit more of the, if a character's looking at something, then sometimes you do a little flashback, inspired by the thing that the character's looking at. So I think it works well. It's not something I've done in the inheritance cycle before, but again, it fit what I was trying to do. So I think the biggest thing I've learned is just a little more flexibility in terms of how to depict information, how to convey those visuals, and also trying to be a little more concise, because scripts are essentially outlines, all
Yeah.
things considered. The descriptions, no one really cares about the quality of that prose a whole lot. So the descriptions are fairly bare bones. What needs to be as good as possible ultimately is the structure and then the dialogue, because the dialogue will be spoken by the actors or some version of it. Now, conversely, I have seen novels written by screenwriters who've gone the opposite direction.
Mhm.
And sometimes they run into the problem where their novels feel very bare bones because they're so used to stripping things down.
Yes.
So trying to balance it both ways. I've written a number of television episodes at this point, or versions of various episodes, and I've always hit my length. I'm not running long, which is good. So I've adapted fairly well to the length requirements, especially given that I did a version of a film script for Eragon back in like 2003 or 4. I think it was like 270 pages or something. So I've gotten better at the length.
Love it. You wrote the two Fractalverse books, and then you came back to Murtagh.
Mhm.
What was the draw that pulled you back to Allegasia after spending a decade away? And
Yeah.
are there more stories to be told there?
Many more, and I'm going to be writing them depending on time and energy. And of course, if this Disney show formally gets off the ground, then, well, A, that'll chew up a lot of my time, but B, I would certainly want to continue creating my own stories in the world of Eragon as a television show was ongoing. Um, I always planned to return to the world of Eragon. It was just a question of when, and when I felt ready. Last year, 2023, was the 20th anniversary of the hardcover publication of Eragon. So it was sitting in the back of my head for a while that, sure would be nice to do something on the 20th anniversary if it worked out.
Right.
And then after I got Fractal Noise out of my hair, I was looking at the calendar and thinking, okay, would I have time to write something soon enough to give it to the publisher that they could hit a publishing deadline in 2023? And when I did the math and thought that, yeah, I could pull this off, and it was like, okay, do I really want to go for it? Is now the time? And it was like, yes, now is the time, and I have a story I'm passionate about, so let's do it. From here on out, I would be very happy alternating between Fractalverse and World of Eragon, just bouncing between the two of them. And I'm doing a lot in the Fractalverse that just is not apparent to the readers, and I'm doing a lot in the World of Eragon that is not apparent to readers either. So with Murtagh, and I've said this elsewhere, uh, I have reached the point now where I have to start to actually deliver answers and payoffs, and and I want to assure anyone watching, answers and payoffs are now coming. All the groundwork is in place.
Oh, so exciting. So exciting. Um, Christopher, one question that I'm curious about is, after 20 years in publishing
Mm,
and having two established series that you're working in, and this is your day job. This
yeah.
You wake up every day and you get to play in these worlds. Um, is there room in your creative life for writing for the fun of it, that doesn't have a contract attached to it, if that makes sense?
That's a
Like
good
do
question.
you still get to write just for the joy of telling a story, even if it's just for you?
Always. I mean, I wouldn't do it otherwise. I'll tell you a secret. Don't tell anyone else.
Uh, d-
Um, I'm
Save
actually
the
not under contract for anything, basically. Actually, there's one small contract I have with Random House, but almost doesn't count. Don't tell Random House that. But I hate writing to contract. I did it for 10 years. I'm not in a position where I need to do it. So
Sure.
do I want to write things outside of the Fractalverse and World of Eragon? Sure, and I probably will at some point, but I love both of those settings. I created them with love, and to get to play in them is not a constraint. I mean, the Fractalverse includes the real world. If I want to go write a Tom Clancy style thriller tomorrow, I could and put it in the Fractalverse. If I want to write a romance novel, same thing. So I don't feel constrained in the slightest, and the stories I want to tell in both those worlds are the stories I truly care about. And yes, sometimes I do things like for fun. Like last week, I wrote a children's book in iambic pentameter. So I don't know if it'll ever get published. It's with my agent right now. I just said, why not? I'll write this. I've been reading so many books to my kids that I was like, you know what? I've got an idea. I'm just going to sit down and do this. So rhyming iambic pentameter, no less. So
I love
yeah.
it. Speaking of agents, can you share advice for authors starting their journey of finding a literary agent? You have an interesting story about how it all, the book got discovered and all of that. So, maybe you don't have the same experience as everyone else, but do you have any insight into, the today's landscape, what it might be like to find a literary agent?
I mean, my experience is so non-standard that I'm not sure I'm really qualified to give advice on that topic. As some of your viewers may know, I got my agent because my family and I self-published Eragon, and I marketed it all across the western half of the United States. I was doing 2 to 3 1-hour-long presentations every day for months on end in schools and libraries. And eventually another author, Carl Hyacin, got a copy of Eragon and passed it on to Random House. It bounced around there, and then eventually one of the editors, my editor-to-be, approached me with an offer, and then about 2 or 3 days later, we had a competing offer from Scholastic with no agent. We realized we didn't know what we didn't know, and so my dad went onto an online publishing forum and asked for advice, and someone recommended a young agent by the name of Simon Lipscar, who was at Writer's House, an agency in New York. And my dad called him and left a long rambling message, and eventually Simon called us back and said, overnight me a copy of the book, and if I like it, I'll represent you. And he's been my agent ever since. And I'll tell you that when Random House and Scholastic found out that I had representation, their offers went up dramatically. And all told, I forget the exact numbers, but I think the advance ended up being 6 times what it originally was because of his involvement, something like that. A good agent pays for themselves.
Right.
A good agent can get you an extra 0.5% or percent on a royalty somewhere. And if you have a successful book, or even even just a moderately successful book, that more than pays for itself over the years. So I think my answer to how to get an agent and how to get published is going to be very facile, but it's also true, which is you need to write a book that people want to read. And the truth is that the publishers nowadays are publishing more books than at any other time in human history. They are desperate for content. And unlike the streaming services, unlike a lot of the studios in Hollywood, they're not cutting back production. They're not laying off hundreds and thousands of people at the moment. People are still reading. People are still buying books. Books are still selling. So they're desperate for content. Is it hard to stand out from the crowd? You bet. Is it hard to actually get some attention? You bet. And especially now, because there are so many ebooks published, so many self-published books, so many AI written books flooding the Amazon marketplace. It is hard to stand out. But if you do the grunt work, especially if you're willing to go out and meet people in person and then sell hard copies, you can still get attention if you're self-publishing. And you don't necessarily have to self-publish. You can also, submit to a publisher, submit to an agency, and go that route. There are authors. I want to say there's a guy by the name of Wesley Dean Smith. I think that's his name.
Yeah.
He considers himself to be a proud member of the pulp tradition, so to speak. He writes so much content per month that he literally publishes a magazine each month of his own material.
Yes. Yes.
And he makes, decent money doing seminars, teaching writing, and of course publishing all his ebooks and his own to his subscribers. That is a valid approach. However, it really depends on your own ability to be massively productive, and there is a trade-off. I think he would probably cop to this himself. There's probably a trade-off in quality between the time spent writing versus the time spent editing. Like, would his books be better if he spent an equal amount of time editing versus writing? Probably, but then he'd be writing less and maybe selling less.
Right. Yeah.
That is a trade-off you have to make.
Yeah, I think for Dean Wesley Smith, he's having a lot of fun doing it the way he's doing it, and he's paying bills and having fun, which is probably exactly what he wants to do. Not trying to speak for Dean, but
and that's a great point too. Is if there's an element of this profession or whatever profession that you have fun at, you should really pay attention to that. This is why we say, do what you love. It's horrible career advice in one sense, but if you enjoy a part of it, you're willing to do more of it than the other guy. And that pays off in the long run. So if being hyper productive is your joy, just embrace it. Accept that you're not going to produce the most polished prose, but you're going to produce a ton of it. So go that route.
Right.
If what really, tickles you is creating beautifully crafted poetic sentences, well, go that route. You're going to do a better job of it than the person who hates obsessing over every sentence.
Right. We're going to take one final question and give you one more opportunity for a no comment. And that is the children's book that you alluded to earlier, the Baby Saphira book?
Hey, Ibid. No, it's not actually. It's a new one that's been bouncing around in my head, and I just knocked it out. The Baby Saphira is still on the docket. I just have got to clear my schedule with these scripts that got dumped on me in the past few months. So I've working really, really hard on that and getting there.
Love it. Well, we still have plenty to look forward to, and that keeps everybody excited. Christopher, always a pleasure to hang out and to just chat and tell everybody what you've got going on. You've got the collector's edition of Murtagh coming, the special edition, whatever you're calling it, this fall. Is that right? When
the deluxe edition of Murtagh comes out October 15th. I will likely be touring for it 7 to 10-ish days, depending. I don't have an exact schedule. Looks like I'm going to be at San Diego Comic-Con as well. Exact panel dates and everything have not been announced as well. I'm also going to be at the Celsius convention in Spain, penultimate weekend of July. So that's coming up pretty soon. And the Grand Rapids Comic-Con in Michigan in November, I think. So deluxe edition of Murtagh, the illustrated edition of Eldest, the second book in the Inheritance cycle, should come out next year. We don't have an exact date for that yet, but if you follow my social media, we'll announce that. I've been reviewing illustrations for that at the moment. The illustrated edition of Eragon also came out last year. So it sold so well. We're doing the next one, and hopefully we'll get to do the whole series. And as far as any future projects, well, I got to actually write them and then I can talk about them. But hopefully that'll be fairly soon. And then, of course, the Eragon television show is in development at Disney Plus, and I'm also developing the television show for To Sleep in a Sea of Stars. And if viewers want to stay up on the news for all of this, they can follow me on social media, on X and Facebook and Instagram, and of course my website, paolini.net. And if you want to see a lot of cool sci-fi stuff, you can check out my science fiction website, which is fractalverse.net.
Excellent. We'll link up all of those places where people can plug in with you in the show notes.
And Random House would kill me if I didn't mention that the deluxe edition of Murtagh is available for pre-order. And it has 5 new pieces of art in it, including custom colored end papers. And here's the big one. I painted the world map for the world of Eragon. Ooh. Yes. And so this is the first time it is ever getting seen. I did it in a rectilinear projection, and then We've done it in a globular projection for Murtag, made it look like an old-timey map, and it's absolutely gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. And there's 2 other colored pieces of art, 2 black and white pieces as well, plus some other, also all the text I wrote. So it is probably the best deluxe edition we've ever done.
And I have a brand new bookshelf that's just needs something to fill it up. So
Awesome.
yeah, I'll just tell my wife to not check the credit card statements for a while, and everything will be fine.
That's right. And then I got to knock out the sequel to Sleep.
Yes, so much fun, so much to look forward to. Christopher, as always, thank you for taking time to come on the show.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for asking such great questions.